All right, everyone. Thank you all for coming tonight for our conversation with Professor Noam Chomsky, Institute Professor Emeritus at MIT and Laureate Professor of Linguistics at the University of Arizona. My name is John George, and I am the President of the Columbia Political Union. Our conversation is hosted jointly by political unions at Columbia, Fordham University, University of Chicago, and Northwestern University. So we're going to separate our conversation into two parts tonight. The first will feature questions prepared by representatives from each of our student groups, and we'll reserve the second half for audience questions. And you're welcome to drop questions in the Q&A section below at any time, but please keep them clear, respectful, and specific. And we'd first like to do brief introductions for the folks that are going to be speaking, asking questions tonight. So let me go with, pass it off to Chase first.
Thanks, John. Hey, everyone. I'm Chase Cottarelli. I'm a sophomore at Columbia University, and I'm the events director for the Political Union.
Hi, everyone. My name is Billy Harrison, and I'm a junior at Fordham University. I'm currently the president and the co-founder of the Political Union at Fordham University.
Hi. Hey, everybody. My name is Felix Balin. I'm a second year at Northwestern University, and I serve as co-president of the Northwestern University Political Union.
And my name is Conrad Mojica. I'm a third year at the University of Chicago and co-president of UChicago's Political Union.
Great. All right, so our guest tonight is certainly a rather difficult person to introduce. Professor Chomsky is the author of more than 150 books on warfare, language, political theory, and the mass media. And he's been at the forefront of the American public sphere since the 1960s. He's also widely recognized as the father of modern linguistics. He's also a major figure in analytical philosophy and cognitive science. He's a prominent activist, having supported American military involvement in Vietnam, opposed American military involvement in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and supported the global Occupy movement, labor rights, and pluralistic access to free speech in the media for decades. He's also been on CIA watch lists. He's been on President Richard Nixon's master list of political opponents and on the London Times short list of makers of the 20th century. He's the recipient of numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, the U.S. Peace Prize from the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation, and the Sydney Peace Prize. And he's also the namesake of a species of bee and a species of frog. Professor Noam Chomsky, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleased to be with you.
That's great. And I'll turn it over to Chase now for our first question.
Thank you, John. And thank you so much, Professor. I'm really looking forward to tonight. I super appreciate you taking the time to speak with all of us. We have a huge audience right now. So,
thank you.
Yeah, to kick off our questions, today marks the first 100 days of the Biden administration. So we want to touch on some of the few of the administration's major policies. The United States and other Western countries have been buying up surplus doses of COVID vaccines, which could be disseminated elsewhere, particularly in developing countries. This Monday, however, the Biden administration announced it would send 60 million AstraZeneca vaccine doses abroad. As we acquire more doses here of current vaccines and potential booster shots, how should we decide what to do with them? And how significant of an effect might this have on American soft power if we give them away?
Well, that's a very interesting topic, not just about the United States, but about all the wealthy countries. So if you recall, a couple of weeks ago, President Biden did release some of the AstraZeneca vaccines to other countries. The US has a store of them that it can't use. The FDA has not yet approved them, so they're just stored away. Who did he give them to? Canada, which has the world's record in storing vaccines beyond what it can use, and Mexico as part of a bribe to keep people fleeing from Central American wreckage, for which we are largely responsible, to keep them from fleeing to the United States. Well, that was the first move. Now he's announced that they're providing supplies of some kind to India, which is in the face of a devastating catastrophe, and some others. Actually, this is a bit better than the European countries are doing. Most of the European countries are monopolizing vaccines for themselves. This is not only unethical beyond any words that I can think of, but it's also suicidal, and they know it. It's a very interesting case where the rich countries are making decisions that they know will harm them in order for basically two reasons. One, greed, and the other to protect the exorbitant patent rights of the huge pharmaceutical corporations that are granted to them by the mislabeled free trade agreements. They know perfectly well, everyone does, that unless Africa and Asia, poor countries in Latin America, have access to vaccines quickly, the virus will mutate. It's already happening. Apparently, there's a new variant in India already. Some of them will be very likely lethal, like Ebola. Some may be worse. It'll come back and harm the wealthy countries. But nevertheless, even to preserve themselves, they have to keep to the principles of both greed and protection of the tremendous profits of a big pharma. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon. It says something about our culture and our moral and intellectual culture.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. I'd like to ask you about perhaps a different area of American foreign policy, and that is Afghanistan. So the United States is set to exit from Afghanistan by September 11th of this year, 20 years after the tragic events which sparked the invasion on that same date in 2001, which is actually longer than some of the lifetimes of many of those in attendance today. So I was wondering, would you please reflect on the legacy of the longest war in American history? Do you agree with Biden's course of action? And additionally, many Republicans and some Democrats, as expected, are upset with this decision, as many argue that it will strengthen the Taliban. How would you respond to this critique?
Well, actually, the longest war in American history started in 1783. One of the major reasons for the American Revolution was a royal proclamation of King George III in 1763, which prevented the colonists from moving westward into the territory of the Indian nations. They were constrained to staying east of the Appalachians. The colonists weren't having that. Certainly, major land speculators like George Washington didn't want that. So as soon as the country succeeded in freeing itself from British rule, began the wars of aggression against the Indian nations. To take the terms that were used by the founding fathers themselves, the great figures of American history, began the wars against that hapless race of Native Americans, which we are exterminating with such merciless perfidy and violence. That's John Quincy Adams, the intellectual author of Manifest Destiny, long after his own contribution to this process was made and before the major genocidal operations which were in the far west in California. So that war went on until the end of the 19th century. It's over 100 years. There have been others. The war after 2011, we should take a look back at it. We should ask ourselves, why did the United States invade Afghanistan? It's a good question. The Afghans were asking right at the time. In fact, they meant the leading Afghan militants who were fighting against the Taliban were bitterly opposed to the US invasion. Now, you can't read about it here, but you can read about it even in the British press or elsewhere. The leading figure in the anti-Taliban resistance, Abdul Haq, was later killed, highly respected, wrote something which actually appeared in the British press, in which he condemned the Americans for wanting to just terrify the world and use their muscle, and not caring at all about the fate of the Afghans, who would be seriously harmed by the then planned invasion. He also said that they're harming, this invasion will harm our efforts to overthrow the Taliban from within, which they were then in the process of doing. 1,000 elders, Afghan elders, had a convocation in Peshawar, across the border, in which they also harshly condemned the invasion for similar reasons. So why did we invade? Was it just to show our muscle and terrify the world, or was it in order to get rid of Al-Qaeda? It's hard to believe. A small police operation could have gotten rid of Al-Qaeda, which was a small group in the Northwest area, AFPAC on the border, probably with the cooperation of the Taliban, who were very eager to get rid of them. They were a thorn in their side. Taliban actually made some offers to extradite Al-Qaeda to some Muslim state where they could be tried. And these offers may or may not have been serious. We don't know, since the Bush administration simply dismissed them, just wanted to invade. Okay, invaded, had a major effect on Al-Qaeda. At that time, it was a tiny group stuck in a small sector of AFPAC, Afghan-Pakistan border. Now, thanks to the invasion, it's all over the world, spread everywhere. It's a great achievement. Meanwhile, we've continued the war in Afghanistan. We're now in a position where it's very difficult to find a solution that is that takes into account the needs of the Afghans. If you look at the discussion here, it's almost 100% concerned with what it means for us. Are we wasting too much money? Are Americans being killed? Should we pull out of this longest war? But what about the Afghans? Do they have something to say about it? Well, actually, they takes us into interesting areas. I should say that the current proposals are not to end the war. Their proposals are to remove American ground troops, which is part of a general shift in war making that has been taking place since the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, if you look back, the US military made a very serious mistake. You can't send draftees, college students who you take off the streets. You can't send them to fight a colonial war. Colonial wars are vicious, brutal, murderous, and they're just not ready for it. So what happened by the late 60s was the Army was beginning to fall apart, to its credit, I should say. Soldiers didn't want to fight. They were getting high on drugs. You had incidents of fragging officers, attacking officers. Basically, the Army wanted them out because the Army was in fact collapsing. Other imperial powers long ago understood this. The British and the French didn't send draftees. The French used the Foreign Legion, professional killers. The British used Gurkhas, sepoys. The officers were British, but you didn't take civilians off the street and think they could fight a colonial war. And since that time, the American military has shifted tactics. By now, it largely uses mercenaries. They're not called mercenaries, they're called contractors, but it's the same thing. Basically, South African killers, others, they can be the people doing the work on the ground with special forces, trained special forces, but only less and less the actual army, which is just not up to this kind of activity. They can fight major wars like Second World War, but not colonial wars, which are just too brutal and murderous. So what's going to happen in Afghanistan, according to current plans, is that the bombing will continue and special forces will presumably continue, and there may be the use of contractors, mercenaries. But that's part of the general shift in war making that's been understood since the Vietnam War, when the US finally recognized what other imperial powers have long understood.
I wanted to turn to the nature of the service industry-based US economy in the 21st century. Earlier in your career, industry-based workers made up the bulk of labor organization movements. With the advent of remote work and the information era labor market among the professional managerial class, particularly post-pandemic, will this change the dynamic and the feasibility of labor organizing?
Well, one thing that's happening is that part of the whole neoliberal system was, for the last 40 years, was to incentivize the corporate management to send manufacturing labor abroad, where they could, this is part of the whole shift to the essentially Friedmanite Reagan principle that corporations have no responsibility to the gift of becoming a corporation is in fact a gift from the public. Public is granting people if you don't want to accept the conditions of corporations, you can be a partnership. You don't get the benefits of incorporating, but the public grants the privileges of incorporation. And the principle of neoliberalism, stated very explicitly by the economic guru, Milton Friedman, was that corporations have no responsibility in return. Their sole responsibility is to enrich themselves and enrich their management and CEOs, nothing for the public. Well, part of that was kind of formalized in the world trade, in the what are called free trade agreements, which don't have much to do with free trade, but the international trade agreements, which did incentivize sending production abroad. And that's what's been done. Now, if you take a look at the American economy, it's kind of interesting. We have lost, it has become, as you said, more of a service economy. It's kind of misleading, though. If you look at the world wealth that is in the hands of US-based multinationals, you get a very different picture. Turns out that US-based multinationals have about 50% of the wealth, including a huge share of world manufacturing, except it's not here. It's somewhere else. But the profits are here, the design is here. In fact, it's interesting, if you take a look at take Apple, world's biggest corporation. By now, it's largely a rentier corporation. A lot of their profit simply comes from royalties paid by China, mainly, sometimes others, for patents that Apple had in the past. The corporation itself is much less geared towards producing products than it was during the period when Steve Jobs was running it. Now it's increasingly under Tom Cook moving to financial manipulations, which are more profitable. There's an interesting book on this by one of the leading correspondents of the Financial Times, Rana Farahar, if you're interested. Something that's happening pretty much across the board in the corporate sector. You can make more immediate profits by predatory financial manipulations than by creating things. So that'll be done under US ownership somewhere else. Taiwanese corporation Foxconn can run the manufacturing plants in China, for example, but the profits come back to Apple. And then in line with the Reaganite theory that wealth has no responsibilities, Apple can set up its headquarters in Ireland, so it doesn't have to pay taxes here. That was also part of Reagan's contribution, opening the door to tax havens illegal before that, and the laws were enforced. So one result is that in the United States, you have shifted substantially to a kind of partly a service economy, partly an economy of precarious labor, sometimes called a gig economy, where people don't have steady, regular jobs. You're on call. So if the employer calls you, says, I want you to work overnight, okay, you work overnight. If they don't call you, you're in trouble. Sometimes called a precariat, people living a precarious existence. You're all familiar with this, of course. This is all over. So these are all ways of kind of undermining the labor, transferring wealth and power from working people to concentrated private capital. That's been the process of neoliberalism for 40 years. So what happens, and in fact, the labor movement has been decimated. Reagan's first act in office, practically, also Thatcher in England pursuing same policies. They recognized, understood, or whoever was doing their thinking for them recognized that if you're going to carry out a major assault against working people, you have to eliminate their means of defense. And the means of defense are unions. In fact, there's a very close correlation between inequality and unionization. Unionization goes up, inequality goes down, conversely, for pretty obvious reasons. So the first acts were to a major attack on labor, opened the doors to corporate attacks on labor. Clinton picked it up, escalated the means for attacking the labor movement, go into that. It's continued until by this point, it's practically nothing. So there are almost no strike actions. They've declined very sharply from throughout the whole period as labor can barely mobilize. Meanwhile, the labor laws and labor administration have been changed to make it almost impossible to carry out a successful strike action. We just saw that with the Amazon juggernaut in Alabama. It's impossible for workers to organize in the face of that. It's gotten much worse under Trump, of course. Trump administration is bitterly anti-labor and maximize the mechanisms for employers to undermine and destroy labor auctions. So that's very low at this point. Now it can come back in interesting ways. It's interesting what's happening. The most recent labor actions, many of them have been from non-unionized workers in red states, anti-union states, non-unionized workers like teachers, West Virginia, Arizona. Teachers' unions went on strike, not just for better pay, which they badly need, but also for better conditions for children, better conditions for education. These are states that have sharply reduced educational expenditures. Arizona, where I'm living, it competes with Mississippi to be at the very bottom of per capita expenditures for children. And it shows up, of course. So the teachers were calling for better services, facilities, and so on for children. Population supports it. They look at voters, yes, that's what they want. The legislature votes it down, just did again. It's conflict right at this moment. But these are these legislature, of course, is Republican. But these strikes had enormous popular support. Like in Tucson, where I live, there were signs all over supporting the teachers' union, stores supporting them, and so on. The teachers, not the teachers' union. This was non-unionized labor action, and pretty effective. And that things like that are happening elsewhere. Sometimes with service unions, like nurses' unions, have been very much in the front. To some extent, it's reaching the major labor force. It was a GM strike, but it's very hard. Biden seems to be somewhat reversing that. He's the first president in a long time to say something positive about unions. Actually, Dwight Eisenhower was probably the last president to do that, very strong statements. But since then, it's reversed. Well, that's my own feeling is that unless the labor movement is reconstituted, redeveloped, as happened in the 1930s, we're not going to have much progress on other fronts. Labor has been in the forefront of positive changes for the general population ever since the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. And it can happen. If I go back to my childhood, 1930s, in the 1920s, where I was born, in fact, the labor movement had been practically wiped out by state violence, mainly Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare, other actions. There was almost nothing left. But in the early 30s, it began to reconstitute. The CIO began to organize. Pretty soon you had militant labor actions. They reached the level of sit-down strikes, which are very frightening to management. A sit-down strike is one step before saying, we don't need bosses, we can run this place ourselves, which they can, in fact. At that point, when you got to really militant labor actions, you suddenly had changes. The Supreme Court stopped vetoing all New Deal legislation, and a major legislation was produced, which has turned the United States into a limited social democracy. We're still benefiting from that. But it was on the crest of a wave of labor organizing. And I think that could happen again. Labor has suffered working people have suffered very seriously during this neoliberal period.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. Thank you again for joining us. This will be our last question from the panel, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. I wanted to switch gears quickly to an issue that I think is salient for a lot of university students in the audience. You've said in the past that when we approach racism and bigotry on university campuses, and indeed in many public spaces of learning, we commit a tactical error when we silence it. We lend it a veneer of respectability, you said. I suspect that a significant portion of our audience today would expect that we lend it a veneer of respectability, racism that is, if we engage with it in substance. We would love it if you might be able to explain your thoughts here and perhaps explain to what degree you think that universities should regulate speech, if at all.
Well, my own feeling is that regulation of speech is, first of all, wrong in principle, but tactically, it's the worst way to deal with racism, fascism, other excrescences of modern civilization. You only support them by regulating and suppressing them. makes it look as if there's something serious there. In fact, it's a benefit if David Duke wants to come to campus and he's banned from coming to campus. It's a big shot in the arm for him. He can say, look, these liberal fascists are preventing me from speaking. I stand up for the values of freedom of expression and discussion. You're just giving him a gift. You want to deal with David Duke or someone else like him? If they're invited to campus, fine, let them come to campus, set up a counter event in which you bring students together to discuss their ideas, to evaluate them, to think about them, to become educated on the issues. You try to do that. First of all, it's an educational experience. You may also find that they refuse to come to campus, which happens over and over. They don't want the confrontation on intellectual grounds. What they want is to be thrown off campus so they can stand up as heroes defending free speech. We've seen this over and over. So it's wrong in principle, and it's a tactical error. The right wing loves it. They run. I mean, Trump runs his campaigns on it. It's wonderful for them. And after all, college should be a place where students are willing to face challenging, questioning ideas, not run away from them, not find safe spaces where they don't hear them, think about them, find out about them. Actually, there was an interesting comment on this by the Raoul Hilberg, the founder of Holocaust studies, the greatest scholar who opened up the field of Holocaust studies and the most respected figure in the field. He was asked at one point what he thought about banning David Irving, noted Holocaust denier. He said, you shouldn't ban him. You should listen to him. Maybe there's something in there that we can learn, but we can certainly learn about the horrors of these ideas and educate ourselves about them. So I think that's the right way to deal with it.
Thank you so much, Professor, for those incredible answers. And now we want to give our audience a chance to ask some questions. And if you'd like to ask a question, we do have a fair amount of questions already asked, which our moderators have been sifting through. But if you'd like to ask one, please make it very clear and specific and type it into the Q&A box. And we will begin with our selection of questions now. And I'll pass it off to Chase.
Yeah, so our first audience question is, can and should we manufacture consent of the American public for objectively good causes? For example, getting a vaccine.
I'm sorry, I didn't grasp the question.
No worries. Can and should we manufacture consent of the American public for objectively good causes? For example, getting a vaccine.
I think we should present people with the reasons for getting a vaccine, but manufacturing consent means controlling their minds. That's not what we want. We want to encourage people to think for themselves, deliberate with others, come up with reasonable solutions to their problems and concerns. That's what should happen in educational institutions, should happen in our dealings with the public. You don't want to browbeat people into accepting your views. You want people, if you think your views are correct, you want people to accept them because they see the logic and the evidence for them. And in the case of vaccines, it's a very serious matter. There's a very large part of the population, they're split in many ways, which is simply refusing to accept vaccines. Latest polls I've seen showed that about a third of Republicans said they were not going to accept vaccines. About another 20% or so said they might not. Well, if half of Republicans don't accept vaccines, we're not going to overcome this. We'll never reach the point where there's sufficient immunity to basically suppress the disease. There'll be more mutations, more problems. It causes enormous harm to the entire population. Well, what do you do about it? You can't win that battle with a club. You have to win it by argument and discussion. Not just on this issue, I should say, also on much more serious issues. The pandemic is bad enough, but we will get over it at tremendous cost and needless cost, as we can see from other countries or parts of this country that have dealt with it properly. So needless cost, but we'll get over it. There are other things we're not going to get over. We're not going to get over the melting of the polar ice caps, of the warming of the ocean. That's over. And if we let that go on, we're basically finished. And if we look at public attitudes on this, it's frightening, very frightening. So there was just a poll a couple of days ago. You can look it up on the internet by the Pew Research Center, main polling agency. They study public attitudes all the time. This particular poll gave people 15 choices as to what they thought were urgent problems, they said major problems that we have to face. So you had a range of choices. They divided into Republicans and Democrats. Among Republicans, at the very bottom, 14% was climate change, the euphemism for global warming. 14% thought that was a major problem. It ranked along with sexism as the lowest, the least urgent problem. The major problems, which is even more frightening, were illegal immigration and the federal deficit. Those are the major problems. Federal deficit, notice, became a problem on November 4th. Before that, it was fine. As long as the Republicans create huge deficits, that's wonderful. If the Democrats create them, can't tolerate it. That's what people hear. That's what they believe. That's what they hear on Fox News. That's what they hear from their leadership. So illegal immigration and the federal deficit are the most urgent problems. Global warming, which is going to destroy the prospects for human life on Earth, is not a serious problem. Now, again, you can't bludgeon people into changing their minds on this. It's a long educational process, and it has to be undertaken, and quickly, in fact, or we're basically going to be finished. This is not a problem that can be overlooked.
Hi again, Professor Chomsky. Here's the second question from the audience. Is it always best to support labor when certain labor unions promote corrupt practices, such as police unions protecting bad cops or construction unions that engage in feather bedding?
Still didn't get it, sorry, try again.
Okay. So is it always best to support labor when certain labor unions promote corrupt practices, such as police unions that protect bad cops or construction unions that engage in feather bedding?
Certainly not. What we should do is support the reform groups in the unions. Almost all of them have reform groups trying to overcome these problems. Teamsters for Democracy, others. So sure, we should support them. We should support the right of people to form unions and support which they want, and the right of people within the unions to struggle against corrupt leadership and to institute democratic unions that work for the workforce, not for gangs somewhere. Okay, so sure.
Again, Professor, thank you for that answer. The next question reads, in the past, you have advocated for the government to stop funding fossil fuel companies. The author of this question supports that. However, do you think that there's a risk that companies reliant on corporate welfare will use this as an excuse to raise oil prices and then blame the left retroactively?
If they raise oil prices, they go out of business, which I think is fine. By now, already, renewable energy is comparable to fossil fuels in cost. If they want to price themselves out of existence, I'll applaud. They ought to go out of existence. So if they want to help do that, great. What we have to do is not just wait for them to destroy themselves. We have to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. We have to move towards efforts to reduce the use of fossil fuels, maybe 5 or 6% every year, till we get to ending fossil fuel use by roughly mid-century. And we have to develop the alternatives, which are available and becoming cheaper all the time. The country needs electrical grids. That's a large infrastructure development. We need construction. Homes have to be reconstructed. That's construction work. Insulation, solar panels, many other things. Weatherization, very important. All of that cuts back waste. It's also good for people, saves them money. Like I live in Arizona, the sun's shining all the time. When I moved in, I put up solar panels. Basically, I get free electricity. I don't have to feel guilty about running the air conditioner when it's 110 degrees outside. And I also don't have to pay $1,000 electric bills like my neighbors do. All of that is to the good, can be done on a massive scale. Plenty of jobs, good jobs, better lives, and ending this crisis. It's a really severe crisis. So if the oil companies want to cooperate by raising prices and pricing themselves out of business, I don't have any objection. We should stop subsidizing them. Banks should stop funding them. Universities should divest from them. Anything that can be done to sensibly to move the country towards a sustainable future with better lives, better work, and no destruction of the environment. And that's perfectly feasible. Can be done within a couple of percentages of gross domestic product. Some of you, I notice, are from Columbia, the Earth Sciences Institute there, Jeff Sachs's institute, has worked lots of ways out in detail to implement this. Same's true of my colleague, Robert Pollan, co-authors, done extensive detailed work, University of Massachusetts, on how to make the move to renewable energy and a better life, better lifestyle within, by very feasible means. It's a lot of money, but it's nowhere near what's spent on other things.
So this next question is our first of the night on linguistics. While you've done much foundational work on theoretical linguistics, do you have any views on language documentation and revitalization? Namely, to what extent should effort and resources be expended to document and revive languages that have been destroyed by forces such as colonialization?
It's a very important thing to do. Actually, my own department at MIT was where I spent most of my life, was in the forefront of this work. This was led by Ken Hale, great linguist, anthropological linguist, did most of his work on Aboriginal languages, Australian, Native American. He was, among the things that he did, that he pioneered, which can be done, was bringing people from the reservations. His case, it was Navajo and Hopi reservations, bringing people to MIT. They're not prepared for graduate work by MIT standards, but he was able to work with them to get them through a very difficult graduate program, get doctoral degrees, do very fine work on their own languages, go back to their own communities, set up cultural centers, language centers. Other faculty members were involved in this. It revitalizes the communities, revives the languages. And in fact, the most spectacular achievement of his was to work with a young woman, Jessie Littledoe, from the Wampanoag tribe. That's the tribe that the language that used to be prevalent in eastern Massachusetts, mostly wiped out, but there are remnants. The language hadn't been spoken for a century, but under Ken's direction, working with Jenny, a couple graduate students, they were able to reconstruct the language from missionary texts, from comparative materials, and so on. Now the language has its first native speaker in 100 years. Jessie Littledoe's daughter, who I think is now about 10 years old, revitalized the whole tribe. They were learning the language, speaking it, cultural institutions, cultural wealth being reconstituted. This is now being done in other places. So yes, it's a very important thing to do all over. Meanwhile, while we're talking about this, we're also wiping out indigenous groups and languages. Some of the worst cases right now are in the Amazon. To get back to the first question, here's another case where the rich and powerful are destroying themselves. Brazil happens to be in the hands of a neo-fascist Trump clone, Trump supporter, who's devastating the country. One of the things he's doing is destroying the Amazon. That means genocide for the indigenous populations of the Amazon. Lots of indigenous groups live there. They're going to be wiped out. But it's much broader than that. Scientists are now predicting that at the current rate of deforestation, by about 10 or 15 years, the Amazon will flip from a carbon sink to a carbon source. It's one of the main carbon sinks in the world. It'll become carbon source, become source, become savanna. Trees decompose, pour carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It should be the opposite. This is one of the sources of oxygen and a sink for carbon. Well, we're doing it. And they're doing it in the interests of short-term profit for loggers and others. But meanwhile, we're involved in it. And it's, of course, devastating for the people there. I mean, the virus is also extremely harmful for them. These are, the tribes in the Amazon, many of them live, hours, if not days, from the nearest health services. You may have to get there by canoe on a long trip. They're not getting services. They should be, just for plain humane reasons. I should say, in addition to this, that if you look around the world, the indigenous populations are in the forefront of trying to save us from our insanity. First Nations in Canada, Native Americans, Aboriginal groups in Australia, American Indian, Native Americans in Brazil are all in the forefront of moving towards working their own traditions of working in harmony with nature instead of destroying it. They're way ahead of us in this and trying to lead the way. Meanwhile, we're wiping them out. But to get back to your question, reviving the languages, the cultures, the societies, that's a major task. particularly when we consider our own historical role in exterminating and destroying them. And we're not alone in this. Same with Europe. They're even worse in many respects.
Our next audience question is, what do you believe is the correct path forward in respect to modern day colonies like Puerto Rico?
Where do we go now? In social organization, in what dimension? A lot of different things. I mean, there's some immediate things we have to do. We have to, there are urgent problems that cannot be overlooked. I mean, like it or not, your generation has to decide whether organized human society is going to persist or not. It's quite a challenge, but it's unavoidable. You're facing questions that have never arisen in human history. Humans have been around for a couple 100,000 years. Last 10,000 years, they've been pretty much harming the environment. The last few hundred years, they've been actively destroying it. It's coming to a head. We can't delay any longer. We have to decide right now whether this process of self-destruction and species destruction is going to continue. And if it does, it'll reach tipping points that are irreversible, or whether we're going to make the efforts that are possible, feasible, within our grasp to ensure not only human survival, but better lives for everyone. And incidentally, it's not just humans. We're in the middle right now of what's called the sixth extinction, where human activity is destroying species at an incredible rate, comparable to 65 million years ago, when 70% or so of life was destroyed by a huge asteroid. Now we're doing it, but much more quickly. That too. Well, that's in your hands, and that's only one problem. There's another equally dangerous, doubly dangerous, because nobody's talking about it, and that is the increasing threat of nuclear war. It's a very severe threat. Anyone who's looked over the record of the last 75 years knows it's a near miracle we've survived this far, and it's getting much worse. Trump administration made it much worse. During part of the general wreckage, which was the hallmark of the administration, was to wreck the arms control regime. There had been an arms control regime painstakingly put in place since Eisenhower. Trump demolished it. Everything he got rid of. Fortunately, he was voted out of office just in time for his successor, Biden, to sign the New START treaty, which extends the effort of the Russians and the Americans to limit nuclear weapons. A couple more hours and it would have been gone. Well, not only that, but he sharply increased the development of lethal, destructive, dangerous weapons, and did it with a flourish. Interesting to watch how this happened. Remember, these are people who may come back into office in 2 years and 4 years, in which case, in my view, we're in deep trouble. So just take a look at what they were doing. 2019, August, anniversary of Hiroshima, Trump dismantled the INF treaty, Reagan-Gorbachev treaty, 1987, which had significantly reduced the threat of war in Europe exploding to the rest of the world. Got rid of that. And in order to hammer the point home, his administration immediately launched weapons violating the treaty, basically telling the Russians, come along, folks, join us in this effort to destroy everything. We don't want to be alone. That's flaunting the violation of the treaties, just like calling for more coal is flaunting the demonstration that we want to destroy the world through global warming. That's what we're facing. We can't talk it out of existence. Well, those are issues that you have to face. You can't neglect them. The third one is the growing risk of pandemics can be stopped, but it won't. If it's left alone, it's going to come. And there are others. The neoliberal attack on the population of the last 40 years has had very serious effects. We even can put some numbers on it now. So the Rand Corporation, super respectable analysis corporation, does analytic work. They just came out with a study a couple months ago in which they tried to estimate the transfer of wealth from the working class and the middle class, lower 90% of the population, transfer of wealth from the lower 90% to the very top during the 40 neoliberal years since Reagan. Almost $50 trillion. It's going to the top fraction of 1% mostly. They've doubled their income from 10% of country's wealth to 20% since Reagan, Clinton, Obama, Bush, and the rest. That's had a terrible effect on them. Incidentally, that's an underestimate because it doesn't take account of what I mentioned before. Reagan opened the spigots on other forms of robbery, like tax havens. It's another couple of tens of trillions of dollars. All right, this has had devastating effects on the society. All of that has to be reversed. Now, after that, there's ways to go on to something better. Let's take the United States, the richest, most powerful country in the world, incomparable advantages. It's an outlier on issue after issue, right in front of our eyes, today's papers. Biden, in his address the other night, proposed extending child care. The whole Republican Party is opposed to it. What are they saying? Child care is everywhere. Every country has it, way more than we're even thinking of. Are we so backward that we can't have what every other country takes for granted? Just every developed country, even poor countries. I mean, it's just shocking that this discussion is even taking place. Actually, one of the chief correspondents at the Financial Times, the world's leading business journal, the woman I mentioned before, Rana Farahar, sort of as a half joke a couple of weeks ago, had a column in which she said that if Bernie Sanders was in Germany, he could be running on the Christian Democrat program, the right-wing party. It's not entirely a joke. His main campaign, the main issues in his campaign are universal health care and free college tuition. Germany has them. Lots of countries have them. Mexico has them. In the United States, that's considered too radical to discuss. How can we have that? How can we afford it? We're such a poor country as compared with Mexico, say. I mean, it's quite shocking what's happening here. So if you ask what ought to be done, you can make a long list, and we can go beyond. There are much more serious issues which ought to be thought about. We might like to bear in mind the fact that there was once, not all that long ago, a Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln, for whom one of their major slogans was that wage labor is no different from slavery, except that it's temporary till you get out of it. The idea of working for a master is an attack on human rights and human dignity that can't be tolerated. They didn't invent it. That was the view for 2,000 years since the Romans, that it's a fundamental attack on human rights and dignity to be subordinated to a master, what we call having a job. Now, that was the main slogan of the very lively labor movement that was developing in the late 19th century. Those who work in the mills should own them. Same with there was an authentic populist movement then, not what's called populism now, which is quite different. A movement of radical farmers. Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma was mostly an agricultural country then. The radical farmers got together and decided they wanted to have a cooperative commonwealth, one in which they worked together for the common good, not subordinated to Northeastern bankers and market managers. They wanted to run it themselves. They were beginning to get together with the main labor movement, the Knights of Labor. If that had happened, could have changed the country, would have become a radical democratic country. It was smashed by force, mostly by violence. But that's a legacy that we can think of too. How about going back to those ideas? Yeah, make a lot of sense. I think there's plenty of things we can think about. Can't hear.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Chomsky. I think we've all learned a great deal, and it's been a great experience for all of us. That is just about all the time we have, but we're very grateful for your time, and to our audience as well. Thank you all for coming out. And we want to take a moment to say we'd encourage you all to get in touch with the political union at your campus for more political programming and speaker events just like tonight. And if you'd like to connect with us, we are putting our email addresses and our social media information in the chat. And with that, I'll say a final thank you for all of us tonight, and definitely, especially to Professor Chomsky. Hope you all have a great night.
Thank you.